bigger armies, the louder marches, the forces that arrived like storms and swept everything aside. For centuries, one belief ruled every battlefield: numbers decide victory. If you bring enough soldiers, you cannot lose. Most commanders trusted this rule without question, and most of the time, they were right. But sometimes history breaks its own rules. Sometimes a smaller force does something impossible. Sometimes intelligence defeats size, discipline defeats chaos, and a handful of warriors crush an invasion that should have erased them from existence. This is one of those stories. At sunrise, the valley looked endless. Open plains stretched for miles, broken only by rocky hills and narrow ridges. It was the kind of land perfect for large armies. Plenty of space to move, plenty of room to surround an enemy, which is exactly why the invaders chose it. They came in numbers no one had seen before.
They thought they could hold us off.
Thousands.
Never stood a chance
Tens
against
of
us.
thousands.
To victory.
Lines of soldiers covering the earth like shadows, spears and banners rising like a forest of steel, drums echoing across the hills, dust clouds swallowing the sky. It didn't look like an army. It looked like a moving empire. Villages burned behind them. Cities had already fallen. Everywhere they marched, resistance collapsed under sheer force. Because how do you fight something that large? Most didn't. Most simply ran. But not this time. On a ridge overlooking the valley stood a much smaller force. So small they almost disappeared against the landscape. A few thousand at most. Tired, under-equipped, outnumbered beyond reason. Anyone comparing the two sides would have predicted the same outcome. They wouldn't last an hour. Even the defenders knew the odds. But they also knew something else. Behind them lay their homeland, their families, their last safe refuge. If the invasion passed through here, there would be nothing left. So retreat wasn't an option, and surrender wasn't a choice. If they were going to fall, they would fall standing. Their commanders studied the terrain carefully. The invaders had numbers, but numbers need space, and space could be taken away. The ridge narrowed into rocky paths and choke points. Hills forced the enemy into tight formations. Cavalry would struggle. Large groups would compress. Here, size could become weakness. Orders spread quietly. No shouting, no panic, just preparation. Shields locked together, spears lowered, archers positioned on higher ground. Every soldier knew his role, because when you're outnumbered, mistakes are fatal. When the invasion began moving forward, the sound was terrifying. Thousands of boots striking the ground at once, metal clashing, war cries rolling like thunder. It felt unstoppable, like watching a flood rushing toward a small wall of stone. But the defenders didn't move. They didn't charge. They didn't scream. They waited, calm, silent, disciplined. The first wave hit fast. Cavalry charging downhill, infantry rushing behind. From a distance, it looked like the end. And then, the charge stopped. The narrow terrain swallowed their momentum. Horses stumbled on uneven rock. Soldiers collided into each other. The front ranks crashed into the defenders' shield wall and couldn't push through. Behind them, thousands more kept advancing, unaware the line had stalled. The invaders crushed themselves. Too many bodies, too little room. Chaos spread instantly. The defenders held firm, shields tight, feet planted, not one step back. When one man tired, another replaced him. When one gap appeared, it closed immediately. They didn't fight wildly. They fought carefully, every strike controlled, every movement deliberate. The invaders attacked again and again, each time louder, each time more desperate. But every charge lost energy before reaching the line. Arrows rained down from above. Spears struck with precision. Short, sudden counterattacks pushed them back just enough to break momentum. Then the defenders locked shields again, like a machine resetting. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, and something unexpected began to happen. The larger army was getting tired, fast. Heavy armor burned their shoulders, throats dried, arms weakened, their attacks grew sloppy, coordination faded. Meanwhile, the smaller force conserved energy, rotated positions, rested in turns. They weren't stronger, they were smarter, and smart armies last longer. Frustration turned into confusion, confusion turned into doubt. How are they still standing? Why can't we break them? Questions like that are poison, because once doubt spreads, morale collapses. Suddenly, the massive invasion didn't look unstoppable anymore. It looked trapped, stuck in its own numbers. Then came the turning point. The defenders launched a small, perfectly timed push from the ridge. Not a reckless charge, just enough pressure, just enough force. The front ranks of the invaders broke formation, and when a large army loses formation, it falls apart fast. Panic spread. Units retreated into each other. Orders were lost. What had been an organized invasion became a confused crowd. And then, they ran. The unstoppable force. Retreating. Thousands turning back down the valley they had marched through with confidence only hours earlier. The defenders didn't chase wildly. They advanced slowly, calmly, because discipline had won the battle, not rage. When silence finally returned, the ridge still belonged to the smaller force, bruised, exhausted, barely standing, but alive and victorious. They hadn't crushed the invasion with numbers. They hadn't overpowered their enemy. They had outthought them, outlasted them, outdisciplined them, and that made all the difference. News of the battle spread quickly, not because of how many enemies they killed, but because of what they proved. That numbers alone don't win wars, that terrain matters, that discipline multiplies strength, and that sometimes a smaller force can crush a massive invasion if they refuse to break. Because history doesn't always belong to the biggest army. Sometimes it belongs to the smartest one. The larger the army, the louder the march, the greater the confidence. For centuries, generals believed one simple truth: numbers decide everything. Bring enough men, enough steel, enough noise, and victory becomes inevitable. Strength, they believed, could crush anything that dared to stand in its way. Most of the time, they were right. Most battles ended quickly, smaller forces broke, defenses collapsed, cities surrendered before the first real clash even began. Because how do you fight something that outnumbers you 10-1? You don't, you run. But sometimes, history surprises us. Sometimes a smaller force does not run. Sometimes it stands still. And sometimes, against every rule of war, that smaller force doesn't just survive, it wins. At sunrise, the valley looked endless. Open land stretched for miles, broken only by rocky hills and narrow ridges. It was the kind of terrain perfect for large armies. Space to move, space to surround, space to overwhelm. Exactly the kind of ground an invading force would choose, and they did. First came the dust on the horizon, then the sound. Thousands of boots striking earth in perfect rhythm, armor clashing, drums pounding like distant thunder. Birds fled the trees. The ground itself seemed to vibrate. Then the banners appeared, hundreds of them. And beneath those banners marched an army so large it looked like a moving shadow covering the land. Rows of infantry, endless spears, cavalry stretching across the plains. Supply wagons trailing behind like a second city. It didn't look like an army. It looked like an empire marching to erase everything ahead of it. Villages had already burned. Towns had fallen without resistance. Every place this invasion touched simply disappear. Their strength came from numbers alone. They didn't need strategy. They didn't need caution. They just pushed forward. And everything broke. Everything. Except this time, high above the valley, on a narrow ridge of rock and dirt, stood a much smaller force. So small they almost blended into the landscape. A few thousand soldiers at most, their armor worn and scratched, shields repaired again and again. Some carried bandages under their sleeves. These weren't fresh troops eager for glory. They were survivors, and they knew exactly what stood behind them: their homes, their families, their last safe refuge. If the invasion crossed this ridge, there would be nothing left. So retreat wasn't an option, not because they were brave, but because they had nowhere left to go. Their commander studied the land carefully. He understood something the invaders didn't. Numbers need space. Take away space, and numbers lose their power. The ridge narrowed into choke points. Steep rocks blocked movement. Only small groups could pass at once. Cavalry would struggle. Large formations would compress. Here, 10,000 men could fight like only a few hundred. Here, discipline could defeat size. Orders moved quietly down the line. No shouting, no speeches, just preparation. Shields locked, spears lowered, archers climbed to higher ground. Every soldier knew his place, because when you are outnumbered, there is no room for mistakes. The invasion began its advance with complete confidence. Drums thundered louder. War cries filled the air. Thousands rushed forward together, certain the smaller force would collapse at the first impact. From a distance, it oaked like the end, like watching a flood rushing toward a fragile wall of stone. The defenders didn't move. They didn't shout. They didn't charge. They simply waited, breathing steady, hands firm, trusting the formation more than their fear. Then the collision came. Steel slammed into shields. The sound exploded across the ridge. The ground shook beneath their feet. For a split second, it felt like the line might snap, but it didn't. The wall held, feet dug into dirt, arms locked tight. Not one soldier stepped back. The charge stopped instantly. Behind the front ranks, thousands more kept pushing forward, unaware the line had stalled. Their own numbers crushed them together. They couldn't swing properly, couldn't maneuver, couldn't even see the enemy clearly. Their greatest strength had become their greatest weakness. Too many bodies, too little room, chaos spread. Officers shouted conflicting orders. Soldiers collided with each other. Horses stumbled on rocks. Momentum vanished. Meanwhile, the defenders stayed calm. When one soldier tired, another replaced him. When one shield cracked, another filled the gap. Every movement controlled, every strike precise. They didn't waste energy. They didn't panic. They fought like a single machine. Hours passed. The invaders attacked again and again. Each time louder, each time weaker. Heavy armor drained strength. Arms slowed, throats burned. Frustration replaced confidence. But the smaller force rotated positions, conserving energy, fighting in short bursts, resting when possible. They weren't stronger. They were smarter. And smart armies last longer. Slowly, doubt began spreading through the invaders. How are they still standing? Why can't we break them? Doubt is deadly in battle, because once soldiers stop believing they can win, they already haven't. Then came the turning point. The defenders launched a small, perfectly timed push downhill, not reckless, not wild, just enough pressure to disrupt the fragile enemy formation. That small movement shattered everything. The compressed ranks broke apart. Orders vanished. Panic spread. Soldiers tripped over each other trying to retreat. The unstoppable invasion, collapsing. For the first time that day, the smaller force advanced, slowly, calmly, like a tide pushing back the storm. And then, unbelievably, the massive army ran. Thousands retreating down the valley they had marched through so confidently only hours before. The defenders didn't chase far. They didn't need to. They had already won. When silence finally returned, the ridge still belonged to them. Bruised, exhausted, barely able to stand, but alive. They hadn't crushed the invasion with strength. They hadn't matched numbers. They had used discipline, terrain, and patience. They had outthought an empire. And that changed everything. Because history doesn't always belong to the biggest army. Sometimes, it belongs to the smallest force that refuses to break. The force that stands firm, the force that fights smart, the force that proves against all odds that a smaller army can crush a massive invasion.